I'm the narrator from the History Channel, and welcome to episode 1 of our new series, The American Revolution. As the year 1776 drew to a close, the American Revolution hung in the balance. George Washington's Continental Army was battered, bruised, and demoralized. They had just suffered a major defeat at the hands of British forces and were forced to retreat through the winter of 1776 across New Jersey. Their numbers had been whittled down to fewer than 3,000 effective troops, and morale was at its lowest point. Soldiers who had once marched proudly under the banner of liberty now deserted in droves, leaving their posts and their country in search of warmer fires and fuller rations. Washington's army, which had begun the war with such promise, now looked like a collection of ragged, starving beggars. Not exactly an image that inspired confidence in their cause. Meanwhile, word of the Americans' desperate plight reached London, where King George II and his ministers rubbed their hands together gleefully. In the eyes of the British, the rebellion was all but over. Lord North, the king's first minister, predicted that the Americans would soon be begging for mercy at the foot of the royal throne. But North and the king were premature in their victory celebrations, for despite appearances, the flame of rebellion still burned brightly in the hearts of most Americans. And so it would continue to burn throughout the long winter of 1776 to 77, sustained by the courage of a handful of men and women who refused to give up the fight for independence. It's me again. This is episode 1 of our new series, The American Revolution. Our last episode was all about the events leading up to the outbreak of armed conflict between Great Britain and her American colonies. And if you haven't listened to that yet, you should probably go and listen to it before continuing here. But if you have, you will know that we ended that episode right after the Declaration of Independence was adopted by the Continental Congress in Philadelphia on July 4th, 1776. But what happened next? What followed from this momentous declaration? To answer that question, we're going to travel to the northernmost outpost of the American military, the town of Cambridge. It was here in July 1776 that General George Washington took command of the Continental Army. His task was nothing short of monumental. He was to mold a ragtag collection of farmers, shopkeepers, and laborers into an effective fighting force, capable of defeating the most powerful empire in the world. July found Washington at his post in Cambridge, watching the British evacuate Boston and take up positions along the Charles River. Across from him stood the town of Charlestown, or as it was known to the locals, Bunker Hill. Now, though there was some debate over exactly where the battle would be fought, there was little doubt in Washington's mind that his troops would have to face the British, sooner or later. So he spent the time before the inevitable engagement fortifying the hills around Charlestown, building breastworks, and planting cannon. The British, led by Lieutenant General William Howe, were eager to engage the Americans, confident that they would be no match for regular soldiers. On June 17, 1776, British forces launched an assault on the American force. What followed has become known to history as the Battle of Bunker Hill. Despite the valiant defense mounted by the Americans, they were eventually forced to retreat, suffering heavy casualties in the process. Though tactically a British victory, the battle was a strategic success for the Americans, demonstrating that they could hold their own against the best the British had to offer. But the victory at Bunker Hill did little to improve the sorry state of the Continental Army. For one thing, their ammunition supply was almost completely depleted. For another, many of the men were nearing the end of their enlistments and would soon be returning home. To prevent this, Washington and his staff spent the time between battles recruiting new troops and training the old. He also attempted to bolster the Army's supply situation by sending Colonel John Stark and a few hundred men to seize British supplies at the garrison of Fort Ticonderoga in Lataoust. Washington received news that Stark's mission had been successful. A convoy of 59 large merchant ships loaded with arms, ammunition, and supplies arrived in Boston Harbor and were unloaded onto American vessels for transport to New York. Washington ordered a contingent of 2,400 troops under the command of Major General Philip Schuyler to rendezvous with the supplies at Albany, New York. Meanwhile, he prepared to launch his own offensive campaign. Now, while the arrival of supplies certainly helped to alleviate the Army's material problems, it did little to address their most critical shortage, manpower. As September wore on, Washington watched helplessly as thousands of men left his army, either because their enlistments were over or because they had been impressed into service by the British. Before long, Washington's force had dwindled to barely 3,000 effective troops. With such a small force, he knew he could not hope to win a decisive victory in open battle. By mid-September, Washington had decided to retreat across the New Jersey peninsula, hoping to draw the British into an ambush. But even as he planned his defensive campaign, his worst fears were realized. One evening, while encamped near the town of Trenton, a group of officers arrived bearing grim tidings. New York had fallen into British hands. Not only that, but General Schuyler had been forced to abandon his post at Albany and flee. The British had seized the entire supply train, including the weapons and ammunition that had been intended for Washington's army. All was not lost. However, despite the setback in New York, Washington's army was still intact, and he was determined to make the best of the situation. He began by sending Major General Israel Putnam and a few hundred men to guard the Hudson River crossings. With the rest of his army, he retreated across New Jersey towards Philadelphia, hoping to secure a base of supplies in the South. As the British advanced under the command of Major General Charles Cornwallis, Washington harassed them with small raiding parties, killing and wounding hundreds. He even managed to inflict a minor defeat on Cornwallis at the Battle of Kingston, New York, forcing him to retreat to Perth Amboy, New Jersey. Despite these setbacks, however, Cornwallis was able to regroup and resume his advance. By early December, Washington's army had retreated to the Delaware River, with the British close behind. The Americans were forced to abandon their encampment at Trenton and flee across the river into Pennsylvania. There, in the midst of a raging blizzard, Washington's army collapsed into a state of utter defeat. Fewer than 3,000 troops, half of whom were without shoes or proper clothing, staggered into camp at Valley Forge. The rest either deserted or fell victim to exposure and disease. Meanwhile, Cornwallis and his officers made preparations for a final assault on the remnants of the Continental Army. But before they could act, Washington made a decision that would turn the tide of the war. He led his army out of Valley Forge and surprised the British at the Battle of Trenton, capturing nearly 1,000 prisoners and giving the Americans a badly needed victory. Despite this victory, however, the war was far from over. The British were regrouping and planning a major offensive campaign for the spring. Meanwhile, Washington's army was in desperate need of supplies, food, and clothing. Worse yet, the men were growing weary of life in the army. Enlistments were running out and men were deserting in droves. To make matters worse, the winter of 1776 to 77 proved to be one of the harshest on record. Blizzards and freezing rain lashed the encampment at Valley Forge, soaking the men to the bone and turning their blankets and clothing into solid blocks of ice. Desertion became more and more common as the winter wore on. Some men simply walked away from their posts, while others made elaborate plans to escape. Captain John Armstrong, for example, enlisted the help of a fellow officer to stage a fake robbery, hoping to make off with some of the army's supplies. When the deception was discovered, both men were put on trial for their lives. Armstrong confessed everything, hoping that his fellow officers would spare him. But when it came time for judgment, they found him guilty and sentenced him to death. The night before his scheduled execution, however, Washington intervened and commuted his sentence to life imprisonment. Armstrong spent the rest of the war languishing in a British prison, never seeing active duty again. Throughout the winter, similar scenes played themselves out across the countryside of New Jersey and Pennsylvania. Men deserted en masse, leaving their officers with barely enough personnel to man the checkpoints. Whole units disappeared, leaving their fortifications undefended. Even the officers began to lose faith in the enterprise, believing that the war was hopeless. On Christmas Day, 1776, only a few weeks before Cornwallis's final assault on the Continental Army, Major General Charles Lee wrote to a friend in Philadelphia, "Everything is going to rack and ruin. Our army is not under the control of any one man. The general idea is to plunder as much as they can, and then to run away. In fine, I never saw such a set of rascals and rogues in my life." And so the stage was set for 1777, a year that would see some of the greatest battles of the American Revolution, and perhaps the birth of a new nation. Thank you for watching. Tune in next week for episode 2, The Road to Saratoga. So today we're going to do something a little different. We're gonna talk about chapter 2 of a book called Washington S. Crossing by David Hackett Fisher. It is a behemoth of a book. I think it has like 800 pages, and we are going to condense it into less than 15 minutes. Let's get started. Chapter Does. Who is George Washington at this moment? A middle-aged Virginian planter accustomed to exercising authority on his own land. He had never commanded large bodies of men, nor waged war, nor been generally responsible for anything beyond his own estate and reputation. But now he found himself placed by his nation at the head of its armies, in a contest that threatened the ruin of all it held dear. In short, this chapter focuses on George Washington and how he got to be where he is. And if you've seen my other videos on Washington's Crossing, this is basically like Origin Story 100. You have to understand who George Washington was at this particular moment in time. Washington was a leader that did not seek the position he was in, but he was one who would grow into it over the course of the next few years. We often think of George Washington as this stoic, unflappable leader, this wooden, kind of Mr. Roboto type figure of a man. And while he certainly could be stern and collected and certainly project an image to others, he was very much a human being with thoughts and feelings and doubts and fears which he would pour out onto the pages of letters to his loved ones and his friends and even his generals. He is a man burdened by the magnitude of the task before him and the weight of the expectations resting upon his shoulders. He writes to John Jay in September of 1775, quote, "My heart is heavy and my head is hot," he says, referring to the burden of his command. And in another letter to his good friend, Dr. James Craik, Washington opens up about the anxieties that come with his role as commander-in-chief. Quote, "I want to see my home and my friends so much that I'm ready to purchase transportation for myself on any terms I can. But then when I consider how little time I can spend with them, how many things must still be done, and how many dangers are yet to be encountered, I feel a considerable discouragement. These moments are sufficient to make me unhappy, though nothing can make me more so than the reflection on my situation, my duty, my country's preservation, and my own private interest, my health, my ease and happiness, or those of my family depending so much on the event of the war, that my mind is continually harassed with the most awful and painful scenes." He writes these kinds of things to his close friends and confidants, but his public face is that of a man confident and resolute in the face of great odds. In a letter to Congress, Washington describes the low spirits among the troops at Cambridge and what he has done to lift their spirits. He says, "In a word, the officers and soldiers seem at a non-play, and such of them as are returned from furloughs have not that alacrity and forwardness that might be expected from men who fight for liberty and the defense of their country. To remedy this, I have thought proper to turn out the whole army every morning at daybreak, to make the parade and field day as rigid and well regulated as possible, and in the afternoon to have officers and soldiers drill and exercise separately. Besides, I've caused all the field pieces and tents to be struck and have prohibited the use of spirituous liquors in the brigades, and have required the officers to be more strict in the government of their soldiers." But behind closed doors, he expresses doubt about his ability to lead the Continental Army against the might of the British Empire. In a letter to his wife, Martha, he worries about his abilities and asks for her prayers on his behalf. Quote, "I know you will be anxious to hear how my public affairs are going on. I can only tell you that I am going on. I know you will be anxious to hear how my public affairs are going on. I can only tell you that I am going on. God knows our poor country is in a critical situation and requires the utmost energy and perseverance in all those who have the happiness of it at heart. If my share of it, in the station to which I have been called, can be useful, the public shall certainly see that it does not fail. But you need not be alarmed for me. I shall be able to support whatever portion of it may fall to my share. My heart is in the right place, and if it was to go to pieces, what better time to go to pieces than now? I am ever yours, G. Washington." What he's saying there is that I'm doing everything I can, but I don't know if it'll be enough. Pray for me. Pray that I'm up to the task. Pray that I don't fail. So there is a contrast between the public perception of George Washington and the reality of what is going on inside his mind. He writes to his general Horatio Gates, telling him to attack the Redcoats under Colonel Johann Raoul at Trenton on Christmas Day. Writing, "I have just recrossed the Delaware on purpose to give you this information. I am, with great truth, your friend and commander-in-chief, George Washington." So you can imagine the anxiety that must have filled George Washington's mind in those moments prior to launching his troops across the icy Delaware River. Also have to consider that George Washington was taking on a pretty sorry lot at this point, And yes, they were fighting for liberty and freedom and independence from tyranny across the sea. But they were a ragtag bunch of farmers and shopkeepers and laborers, poorly trained, poorly equipped, and they were outnumbered and outgunned by the professional soldiers sent against them by King George II. They had no formal military training. Many of them had never fired a musket before, and George Washington was tasked with forging them into a credible fighting force. It's a tall order, to be sure. And one reason George Washington succeeded where so many others have failed in similar situations was because of his capacity to learn from others around him. He realized he didn't have all the answers, and he was open to suggestions from his generals and his fellow commanders. A perfect example of this is the Battle of Trenton. George Washington wanted to attack the Hessians in Trenton because he knew the psychological impact it could have on the American people. But it was his generals that convinced him to wait for reinforcements and launch a surprise attack early in the morning, which is exactly what happened. So you can see here how George Washington wasn't married to any particular plan or idea. He was open to suggestions from others, and he trusted the judgment of his generals. He inherited a precarious situation from the previous commander, Henitas Schuyler, who left behind a demoralized army that was on the verge of collapse. Yet Washington somehow managed to stabilize the situation, get the army ready to fight, and pull off a stunning victory at Trenton. So you've got to remember that at this point in the war, the Americans had lost their first 4 battles. They were outgunned and outnumbered. Their army was on the verge of collapse. They weren't even sure they were going to be able to continue the fight. And yet George Washington inspired these men, pulled them back from the brink, and led them to victory in a battle that proved to be a turning point in the entire war. That's why this chapter is titled, Who Was George Washington at This Moment? Because understanding who George Washington was at this moment in time is so important to understanding the rest of the story. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and leave us a review. Also, we have a chat room now, so join up and say hi. There should be a link in the description below. Thanks for watching. I'm the author of a book about the American Revolution, and today we're going to look at Chapter 3, The British and Their Hessian Allies. Now, one of the things that people sometimes don't really think about when they think about the American Revolution is just how international it was. And this is because, even though we often focus on the Americans on one side and the British on the other, there were many participants from other countries on both sides. Today, we're going to look at one group in particular, the Hessians, who were an important part of the British effort during the war. The term Hessian is actually a nickname that Americans gave to German mercenaries who fought for the British during the Revolutionary War. So, why did Britain bring these mercenaries into the conflict? Well, for a couple of reasons. One is that they just needed soldiers. The British weren't able to raise enough volunteers to fight the war that they wanted to fight, and so they had to look elsewhere, and they turned to Germany, where they had some success. In fact, by the end of the war, over 30,000 Germans would serve as mercenaries for the British. The second reason is that Britain thought that the Germans would have a psychological impact on the Americans. This is because in the colonial era, Germany was known for its highly disciplined military forces, especially its mercenaries, which were famous all over Europe for their effectiveness. And so it was thought that if the Germans were put up against the Americans, that the Americans would just automatically lose because of the reputation of German mercenaries. But as we'll see, that didn't always work out the way that the British wanted it to. One of the most famous groups of Hessians were those stationed in Trenton, New Jersey, and we'll talk more about them in a minute. But first, let me tell you about another group of Hessians who were stationed at Fort Montgomery in New York. And we're talking about them because they have a connection to George Washington. In October of 1776, George Washington and his troops were driving the British south along the Hudson River, and he got them trapped at Fort Montgomery and Fort Constitution. Now, Washington had heard that there were 2,000 British troops in those forts, but in reality there were only 400, and half of them were Hessians. On October 20th, Washington ordered General David Wooster to attack the fort. Now, Wooster was a former Tory who had been captured by the British and then released, and he was eager to show the British what he could do. He sent a force of 1,500 men toward the fort. But what happened is that the British were expecting an attack, and the Hessians were able to repel the attack. And in fact, they repelled 2 more attacks before the Americans finally took the fort. The Hessians defended the fort so well, in fact, that after they were defeated, The British commander said to them, "You have done everything that men could do to have acquired the reputation of being the bravest troops in the world." So now that we've talked about these Hessians at Fort Montgomery, let's talk about the ones that were stationed in Trenton. And again, these are just a small sample of the larger group of Hessians who fought during the Revolutionary War. But the Hessians stationed in Trenton really played a significant role in the early years of the war. These Hessians arrived in the city in the summer of 1776, and they were accompanied by a number of British regulars. They occupied buildings all over the city, including the old barracks on the corner of Front and Hanover Streets. And like many cities during the war, Trenton became a garrison town, and so the Hessians were there for the duration. The Hessians stationed in Trenton were part of the 2nd and 3rd Battalions of the 28th Regiment of Foot. The 2nd Battalion consisted of 4 companies, or roughly 400 men, and these guys were under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Johann Rowell. Then the 3rd Battalion also had 4 companies, and they were commanded by Major General Karl von den Opp. Now, while the Hessians were stationed in Trenton, they engaged in some pretty typical garrison activities. They drilled, they marched around town, and they generally tried to keep order. And despite what some people might say, there's no evidence that they caroused around the city, heading drunk and causing general mayhem. Although that is a story that has survived, and it's a good one. On December 1776, George Washington led his army across the Delaware River and surprised the Hessians stationed in Trenton. The Hessians had been expecting an attack from the north, so they were totally caught off guard. Many of them were sleeping when the attack began. They lost 28 men killed, 46 wounded, and 96 captured. Only 20 escaped. It was an embarrassing defeat and a serious blow to the British. And it not only hurt them militarily, it hurt them psychologically as well. Because once news of the defeat reached England, the British realized that the Hessians weren't as invincible as they thought they were. But the British still decided to continue hiring Hessians for the rest of the war. And in fact, the Hessians would continue to serve the British until the very end. So who were these Hessians who were stationed in Trenton? Well, they came from a variety of places. Some were from Hesse, others from Hesse, and some were even from the Holy Roman Empire. And this mix is pretty typical of the Hessians in general. In fact, it wasn't unusual for Hessians to come from many different German states, and some people have mistakenly thought that these Hessians were somehow better soldiers, because they came from a place with a strong military tradition. And that may have been true of some of them, but it wasn't true of all of them. In fact, the vast majority of Hessians were conscripts, and this means that they were just regular German peasants who were forced into service. In fact, the Hessians weren't technically mercenaries, because a mercenary is someone who volunteers for service. Most Hessians were just forced into serving the British, and this wasn't any different than the way that the British raised their own forces. Men were conscripted into the British Army, and that's why many Hessians were pretty upset about their situation. Some people have also argued that the Hessians were better soldiers than the Americans, and that may have been true in some cases, but again, it wasn't true in all cases. In fact, many of the Hessians were quite green when they arrived in America, and the ones who were more experienced tended to be officers. That being said, the Hessians did have some advantages over the Americans. First of all, they were used to fighting in close quarters, and this was something that the Americans really struggled with. Ever since the French and Indian War, the British had been fighting wars in Europe, where they had to fight in close quarters, in forests, and in hilly terrain, and so they were pretty good at it. Meanwhile, most of the Americans' military experience came from fighting in North America, where open field battles were the norm, and so the Americans struggled in close-quarter combat. Secondly, the Hessians tended to be bigger and stronger than the Americans, and this is something that people don't really talk about very much when they talk about the Revolutionary War. But size and strength really did play a role, and it is important to remember that the average European man was shorter and stockier than the average American man, and this was especially true of the Germans, and so the Hessians were physically stronger than the Americans. Finally, the Hessians often fought with fixed bayonets, and the Americans didn't. Now, most people associate the use of bayonets with the British, but it was actually the Hessians who really pioneered the use of fixed bayonet. In fact, it was common for Hessians to charge into battle with their rifles held horizontally and their bayonets pointed straight up, ready to strike. And this gave them a significant advantage over the Americans, who often had to resort to using their bayonets as stabbing weapons. So with all of these advantages, it's no wonder that the British thought that the Hessians would do well against the Americans. But as we saw earlier, that wasn't always the case. So why did the Hessians sometimes lose battles? Well, one reason is that they were often led by inexperienced officers. As we saw earlier, the vast majority of Hessians were conscripts, and this meant that their officers often knew little about their men, and their men often knew little about their officers. Another reason is that the Hessians were often poorly supplied. The British were notorious for not supplying their troops very well, and the Hessians were no exception. In fact, it was so bad in some cases that Hessians have reported eating nothing but soup for months, and this made it difficult for them to sustain themselves in the long term. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, the Hessians often lacked something that the Americans had in abundance, and that was motivation. The Americans were fighting for their homes and their families, and many of them were willing to endure great hardship for that cause. The Hessians, on the other hand, were fighting for the King of England, and this made it difficult for them to stay motivated, especially when they were poorly treated and poorly supplied. Ultimately, the Hessians played an important role in the Revolutionary War. They were brave and disciplined soldiers who fought hard for the British. But they were also victims of circumstance. They were conscripted into the British Army, and they were often poorly treated, and this made it difficult for them to succeed in the long run. And that brings us to the end of Chapter 3. If you'd like to learn more about the American Revolution, please check out my book, A Day of Empire, or subscribe to my channel. The American Revolutionary War is one of the most important periods in world history, and if you want to learn about it, there's no better place than this channel. Every week we bring you new videos on everything from major battles to obscure military tactics to the fascinating people who played key roles in this war. And now we are pleased to announce our next video is on Chapter 4, Retreat and Desperation. So join us as we bring you the story of the American Revolution. General Cornwallis had pushed Washington's army all the way across New Jersey. The Southerners were tenacious and the Northerners were green. Washington had hoped to stop the British at Trenton, but instead had been forced to retreat south. He wanted to regroup at Princeton, but he was too late. Cornwallis had taken the town. Now, his only hope was to escape across the Delaware River into Pennsylvania and set up a base of operations there. It was Christmas night, 1776, when Washington led his troops into Pennsylvania. They had marched for 9 days without stopping, and although they'd won some engagements, the overall situation was grim. Many of their rifles were out of ammunition. Their clothes were tattered and torn, and now the winter weather was starting to set in. It was a perfect storm for disaster. As they made their way north, the Americans left behind them a long train of artillery, wagons, and other supplies, so much so that it took 5 whole days to move it all along. This was a huge mistake. Had he known what was coming, Washington would have moved it all along with him, but he didn't. And soon the Continental Army was close to disintegration. They were exhausted, hungry, ill, and cold. Snow fell in thick blankets, making fires useless against the biting wind. The soldiers huddled together for warmth, sharing whatever rations they could find. Barefoot and starving, they trudged through the snowdrifts, their shoes having long since worn out. One can only imagine the thoughts that must have raced through the minds of those poor devils. Were they ever going to see their homes again? Was this hopeless fight ever going to end? Would they ever get warm again? Washington knew how bad things were and tried his best to lift the men's spirits. He made sure they knew that Cornwallis hadn't pursued them after crossing the Delaware. And he told them, "Let not your hearts be troubled. We shall have a glorious victory by the next time we meet the enemy." Washington's optimism was contagious and helped the men keep moving forward, if only because they didn't want to let their commander down. Cornwallis did not pursue them across the river. Perhaps he thought they'd be too strong a force to engage, or perhaps he felt confident in his advantage and simply decided to wait for the Americans to make the first move. But Washington wasn't planning on giving him that chance. He knew he needed more supplies and reinforcements if he was going to stand a chance against the British. He spent the next few weeks drilling and training the new recruits while sending out foraging parties to gather food and supplies for his troops. But even though the men were getting better organized, their situation was still desperate. Colonel John Nolan wrote home to his wife, "Our naked and starving soldiers are a disgrace to the continent. Our camp is a perfect picture of misery and despair. There is nothing here but death defeat, and destruction. It's hard to paint a clearer picture of the dire straits the Americans found themselves in, but fortunately for them, help was on the way. A series of supply depots had been established in Pennsylvania, and Major General Anthony Wayne was on his way with reinforcements. But these supplies and soldiers would need to find the Continental Army before they were captured by the British. They needed guidance. Someone to lead them to the hidden patriots. Enter Thomas Paine. He was a writer and political activist who'd come to America from England. Paine was a believer in democracy and the American cause, and now he was putting his beliefs into action by writing a pamphlet to inspire the Continental Army. He called it The Crisis, and it's become one of the most famous pieces of writing in American history. In it, he writes, "These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in such a moment, either be separated or fall by the wayside. The arduous enterprise will be tutored by from a handful of heroes, and love of country will be the ruling passion of the soul." His words are a call to arms, urging the Americans to stand firm against the British. They were the underdogs, but they were fighting for a just cause. All they had to do was believe in themselves. His pamphlets were distributed throughout the army, read aloud to the troops by officers and passed from hand to hand until every man had a chance to read them. The soldiers were inspired by his words and renewed their commitment to the fight for freedom. As one soldier wrote home, "We have just received the most excellent pamphlet from General Washington's headquarters, entitled The Crisis. It contains the most powerful stuff that ever I read. It stirs a man up to action and makes him ready to go through any hardships to defend his country." Paine's words were a shot of adrenaline to the demoralized troops, but they still needed supplies. Luckily, Wayne found them. He delivered 300 barrels of flour, several thousand muskets, and enough clothing to outfit the entire army. The soldiers were overjoyed. Not only did they have enough to eat and wear, but they also had the weapons they needed to fight. With their strength renewed, Washington's army was ready to take on the British once more. At Princeton, the Patriots and the British were dug in, facing each other across an open field. The outcome of this battle would have major implications for both sides. If the Americans could win, they might be able to hold on to their dream of independence, but if they lost, it could be the end of their fight. The battle began with a heavy fog, which played right into Washington's hands. The Continental Army attacked at dawn, hoping to catch the British off guard. It worked perfectly. The Americans were able to get close to the British lines before they were spotted, and then the battle was on. The fight was fierce, and neither side would back down. But as the fog lifted, the American troops started to gain the upper hand. By noon, the battle was over. The Americans had won, but it wasn't easy. They'd suffered heavy casualties, but so had the British. It was a victory that would give them some breathing room and maybe even give them a chance to turn the tide of the war. Washington and his army retreated to Morristown, where they established a strong defensive position. They were safe there, for now. But it was only a matter of time before Cornwallis came looking for another fight. The British general was determined to crush the rebellion once and for all, and he wasn't going to let Washington get away with this little victory. As Washington settled in for the long haul, he knew he had a lot of work ahead of him. He needed to keep his army supplied and ready to fight, but he also needed to win the support of the American people. The war was going badly, and he needed to convince the people that their sacrifices were worth it. In a speech to the Virginia Convention, he laid out his vision for the future of America. He told the delegates that the war was necessary to protect the rights of the people, and that it was their duty to support the troops. He urged them to pass laws that would help the soldiers and their families, and he promised that the war would be over soon. The Americans would win their independence, and they would create a new nation based on liberty and justice. His words were inspiring, and the delegates responded by passing laws that provided for the soldiers and their families. But Washington knew that the war was far from over. He had to keep his army strong, and he had to keep the people hopeful. It wouldn't be easy, but he was up for the challenge. Hey everyone, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please remember to like and subscribe so you never miss an episode. Also, be sure to check out our other content, where we discuss everything from military tactics to fascinating people in history. Chapter 5, Washington's Bold Gamble. As the year 1776 drew to a close, George Washington found himself in a most precarious situation. After suffering defeat after defeat at the hands of the British, His army of nearly 20,000 men had dwindled to just 3,000 battle-hardened troops. Morale was low, and desertions were rife. Winter was fast approaching, and supplies were critically low. If he couldn't find a way to turn the tide of the war around quickly, he risked losing everything. So he hatched a plan, a bold, audacious plan that would take him into enemy territory and strike a decisive blow that would shock the world. But was it madness or genius? We're here today to talk about this and so much more. Welcome back to the channel. And before we get started, thank you guys so much for your support. We're getting ever so close to 1 million subscribers. And what I'm trying to say is there is a new banner at the top of the screen right now where you can help us get there faster. Just click on it and follow the instructions. Let's get back to the video. Throughout December of 1776, George Washington and his officers met in secret to discuss their options. For the Continental Army, its effectiveness had been blunted by a series of defeats and its numbers depleted by thousands of desertions. With winter coming on apace, they needed a victory to turn things around, and time was running out. At these secret meetings, the topic of who should lead the army in the upcoming campaign was also discussed. Some advocated for Major General Richard Montgomery, who had seen action in Canada and was considered to be a skilled commander. Others supported Major General Horatio Gates, who had gained recognition for his defense of the city of Saratoga. However, many, including the influential John Hancock, believed that George Washington was the best choice to lead the army, despite his inexperience as a general. Ultimately, the delegates voted and elected George Washington as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. This decision gave Washington the authority and resources to implement his audacious plan. In order to pull off his plan, he would need all available troops, plus a bit of luck. In addition to this, he knew he needed to choose the right location. There were two locations that had him most interested: Trenton and Princeton. Both were less than 100 miles from his current position. The first objective presented fewer logistical challenges, and the second was the more direct route to Philadelphia. And while Washington eventually opted to go with Trenton, he almost went with Princeton. In fact, late into the night on December 25th, he made up his mind to strike Princeton. But the next morning, intelligence arrived that changed everything. He learned that British reinforcements had arrived at Princeton, making it a less desirable target. So instead, he shifted his focus back to Trenton. It was close enough to allow for a quick march, and its garrison of Hessians were known to be poorly trained and undisciplined. Furthermore, the strategic value of capturing Trenton was significant. If successful, it would open up the possibility of gaining control of the Delaware River, which would serve as a lifeline for the army during the winter months. Not to mention, if he could score a victory against the Hessians, he could bring much-needed morale back to the flagging Continental Army. The final piece of the puzzle was timing. He wanted to catch the Hessians by surprise, and there was no better time to do that than Christmas night. However, crossing the ice-jammed Delaware River in the dead of night with thousands of men would be a risky endeavor in itself. As such, Washington spent several days observing the weather and river conditions to ensure the safety of his troops. Ultimately, he decided that the night of December was suitable for the operation. Everything had fallen into place, and Washington was ready to make his move. On the evening of December 25th, 1776, a thick fog hung over the Delaware River, providing the perfect cover for secrecy. George Washington and his 2,400 soldiers embarked on a daring mission across the icy waters. Despite the bitter, cold, and treacherous conditions, the men rowed with determination. Their goal, to reach the town of Trenton unnoticed. As they made their way across the river, the silence was broken only by the rhythmic splashing of oars in the water and the muffled voices of the soldiers coordinating their movements. Each stroke of the oars brought them closer to their destination and the promise of a much-needed victory. Meanwhile, unaware of the impending danger, the Hessians stationed in Trenton celebrated Christmas with relative peace, but their merriment was about to come to an abrupt end. As the first rays of dawn began to break, Washington's troops stealthily landed on the outskirts of town. Moving with precision and purpose, they quickly took up positions surrounding the unsuspecting head. As the sun rose higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the snow-covered ground, the soldiers waited patiently for the signal. Suddenly, a volley of musket fire shattered the morning calm, signaling the start of the attack. Caught off guard and outnumbered, the Hessian soldiers desperately attempted to defend themselves, but it was too late. Washington's forces were well prepared and determined. They fought with the ferocity of men who had nothing to lose and everything to gain. The Hessians, on the other hand, were disorganized and demoralized. Their resistance was futile, and soon they were forced to surrender. News of the victory spread like wildfire through the colonies. People celebrated in the streets, their cheers echoing the sentiments of a nation. Washington had done the impossible. He had secured a much-needed win that breathed new life into the faltering revolution. The significance of the battle extended far beyond the military victory. It was a triumph of the human spirit, a testament to the courage and determination of those who dared to dream of freedom. In one swift stroke, George Washington had turned the tide of the war, and as the dust settled on the battlefield, one thing became clear. The Revolutionary War was far from over. While the Battle of Trenton was undoubtedly a turning point in the war, it wasn't solely responsible for the ultimate victory. Rather, it was one significant event in a long and arduous struggle. Nevertheless, without Washington's bold gamble, who knows how the war would have turned out? Perhaps the Continental Army would have lost heart, and the revolution would have fizzled out. But Washington's audacity breathed new life into the fight, setting in motion a chain of events that ultimately led to American independence. In fact, the success of the Battle of Trenton can be attributed to a number of factors. First and foremost, Washington's decision to launch a surprise attack on Christmas Day caught the Hessians off guard. The element of surprise was crucial in achieving victory, as it allowed the Continental Army to take the offensive and dictate the terms of the engagement. Secondly, the Continental Army's use of deception and concealment was instrumental in ensuring the success of the operation. By keeping their movements secret and exploiting the thick fog to their advantage, they were able to approach Trenton undetected, allowing for a swift and decisive attack. Additionally, the military leadership and planning that went into the operation was a key factor. Washington and his officers carefully considered the logistics, timing, and strategy involved in crossing the Delaware River and launching a surprise attack. This meticulous planning paid off, enabling the Army to execute their mission with precision and efficiency. Furthermore, the bravery and determination of the soldiers cannot be overlooked. Despite facing bitter cold, icy waters, and the threat of British reinforcements, the soldiers pressed on with unwavering resolve. Their commitment to the cause and willingness to endure hardship were instrumental in achieving victory. Finally, the victory at Trenton was also due in part to the weaknesses of the Hessian forces. The troops were reportedly undermanned, poorly trained, and lacking in morale, which contributed to their inability to mount an effective defense against the Continental Army. Nevertheless, the aftermath of the battle was not without its challenges. In the wake of the victory, Washington's army faced numerous obstacles as they sought to consolidate their gains and continue the fight. One of the most significant challenges was the need to resupply and reinforce the army. The victory at Trenton had depleted their own supplies, and they were in urgent need of reinforcements. Washington worked tirelessly to address these issues, appealing to the Continental Congress for additional resources and reaching out to foreign allies for support. Additionally, the Army faced constant threats from British forces who were eager to avenge their defeat at Trenton. Washington had to remain vigilant, employing defensive strategies and tactical maneuvers to protect his army from attack. Moreover, internal divisions and political pressures also posed a challenge to Washington's leadership. He had to navigate complex political alliances and manage the expectations of various factions within the colonies, while also dealing with the personal ambitions and rivalries of some of his fellow generals. Despite these challenges, George Washington and his army persevered. They built up their forces, secured vital supplies, and continued to engage the British in a series of battles that ultimately led to the American victory in the war. And as the years went by and the war drew to a close, the memory of Washington's bold gamble at Trenton became a defining moment in American history. It served as a reminder of the courage, determination, and strategic brilliance that had led the nation to freedom, and so it stands as a testament to the enduring legacy of George Washington and the birth of a new nation. What did you think of George Washington's bold gamble? Let me know down in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already, so you never miss an upload. Chapter 6. The Delaware River in Winter. The geography of the Delaware River is such that it should not freeze over. It has a pretty substantial current even in the winter, and so for most of its length, There's open water, but that doesn't mean it's not dangerous. In fact, it's downright deadly. The currents are fierce. There are ice flows that come barreling down the river, and because it's so wide, there's really no place to get out of the way. So if you fall in, you're probably going to die from exposure. The river is bitter cold and the temperatures are well below freezing. This is the story of Lewis and Clark, their corps of discovery, and the challenges they faced traveling along the Missouri River back in the early 1800s. This is their story. Chapter 6: The Delaware River in Winter. As we talked about in the last episode, Lewis and Clark had come up against an absolute wall at the Missouri River. It was late December, the middle of winter, and the river was raging. They could hear the roar of the water every night as the temperatures dropped and froze the river. Every morning they would wake up and find new layers of ice covering the river. These were not thin layers of ice that they could chop through with axes. No, these were thick slabs of ice, sometimes 4 inches or more, and the only way to clear them was to wait for the sun to rise high enough in the sky to melt the ice, just enough to allow their boats to slide underneath. Then they had to move quickly before the sun dipped back down and refroze the river again. It was slow, exhausting work, and as the days wore on, the men grew weary. Some of them thought they should have turned back long ago, but Lewis and Clark pressed on, determined to reach the Pacific Ocean. They needed to keep moving, and so they set up camp near the riverbank and waited for the sun to do their work. Meanwhile, across the river, on the south side, lived a Native American tribe. They had seen the explorers struggling to navigate the ice-jammed river, and they invited them over to stay with them until the weather warmed up. Lewis and Clark considered this offer carefully. On one hand, they would be safe and warm here, and it would give them time to regroup and figure out what to do next. But on the other hand, their orders were to explore as much of the Louisiana Purchase as possible, and staying with the Native Americans would take them off course. In the end, they decided to turn down the offer and stay by the river. They figured it would only delay them for a few weeks at most, and then they'd be able to continue on their journey. But the weeks turned into months, and the longer they stayed by the river, the more desperate they became. Their food supplies were dwindling, and they were forced to rely on the kindness of strangers to keep them alive. They did meet some friendly people, but the majority of them were not so friendly. They were fur traders who had been stuck on the river for months. Hoostlike team, and they weren't happy about the competition. Lewis and Clark tried to make the best of it. Though they traded with the fur traders, sharing what little food they had left for fresh meat and other supplies. Finally, in early February, the ice started to break up. Lewis and Clark wasted no time in getting their boats into the water and starting downriver. The current was strong, the water was cold, and there were still patches of ice floating past them, but they were finally moving again. As they traveled downriver, the weather began to warm up and the ice in the river began to melt. By mid-February, the river was mostly free of ice, and the explorers were able to make good progress. They traveled about 20 miles per day, stopping each evening to camp on the riverbank. As the days grew longer and the weather grew warmer, the men began to feel better. Their spirits lifted, and they started to see wildlife again. They saw deer, elk, beaver, and even a few buffalo. They also saw more people, both friendly and not so friendly. But the explorers were too busy to worry about making enemies. They had a long way to go and little time to spare. By early March, the explorers had reached a small village where they hoped to find supplies and maybe even a guide to help them through the rest of the journey. They were out of luck. The village was small and the people there didn't have much to offer them. But just when they were about to give up hope, they met an old French-Canadian trapper named Pierre. Pierre had been trapping in the area for many years, and he knew the river well. He agreed to guide the explorers the rest of the way to the Mississippi River, and they were grateful for his help. As they traveled downriver, Pierre told them stories about the area and helped them navigate the treacherous waters. Finally, on March 23rd, 1804, Lewis and Clark reached the Mississippi River. They had traveled more than 2,000 miles from St. Louis, and they were exhausted. They had been on the river for months, and the journey had taken a heavy toll on them, but they were relieved to reach the Mississippi. From here, it was a short trip to New Orleans, and the beginning of their journey back home. But their journey was not over yet. When they arrived in New Orleans, they learned that the city was in chaos. There had been a hurricane and a yellow fever epidemic, and the city was in ruins. They had to travel overland to the nearest jail, and then it was a long walk to their final destination. But finally, on July 25, 1804, Lewis and Clark reached the White House and presented their findings to President Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson was overjoyed. The explorers had found a route to the Pacific Ocean, and it was everything he had hoped for. Now, this is where I usually talk about how the explorers encountered Native American tribes along the way and how they made alliances with some of them and fought battles with others. But the truth is, they didn't encounter any Native American tribes on this journey. The reason is because of the ice. The explorers were stuck by the Missouri River for months and couldn't move on until the ice melted. And when they finally started moving again, they were in such a hurry to get to the Mississippi River that they didn't stop to explore. So we do wanna know what kind of Native American tribes they would have found if they had kept going. But we do know that there were plenty of them around. There were about 40 different Native American tribes living in the area that Lewis and Clark traveled through. Some of them were very friendly, like the Mandan and Hidatsa, people who welcomed the explorers into their villages and shared their food and supplies with them. Other tribes were more neutral, like the Sioux and the Cheyenne. They didn't bother the explorers, but they also didn't help them. And then there were the hostile tribes, like the Blackfeet and the Crow. They didn't like the explorers being in their territory, and they attacked them on several occasions. If Lewis and Clark had been able to continue on to the Pacific Ocean, they would have found even more Native American tribes. There were dozens of tribes living in the area that they were headed to, like the Chinook and the Nez Perce. But they never got that far. You might be wondering why the explorers didn't just head back once they realized that it was not going to be possible to get to the Pacific Ocean. The answer is, they had to keep moving forward. They didn't have a choice, you see. The river was their only means of transportation. They couldn't just turn around and walk back. Plus, they were carrying enough supplies to last them only a few months. And once those supplies ran out, they'd have to live off the land. And they didn't know what kind of food would be available to them. Walking back meant risking starvation. So they had to keep moving forward, no matter how dangerous it was. And dangerous it was. The river was filled with obstacles, like rocks, rapids, and waterfalls. The explorers had to portage around some of these obstacles, which meant carrying their boats and supplies on their backs and walking around the river. That was hard work, and it took a lot of time. But the explorers were determined to succeed. They had come too far to turn back now. Eventually, the river became too dangerous to navigate, and the explorers had to find another way to continue their journey. They built boats and set sail down the Columbia River instead. But that's a story for another time. The journey was fraught with peril, but the explorers pressed on. They wanted to prove that it was possible to cross the continent by water, and they succeeded. They proved that it could be done, but at a great cost. Many of the men with them died from exposure, starvation, and disease. But those who survived returned to tell the tale, and that tale has inspired generations of adventurers ever since. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the channel and leave a review on whatever platform you're listening on. Thanks. The year is 1776. You are watching the story of the crossing of the Delaware, brought to you by the people of a local town and produced by a local theater company. Please enjoy the show. And now back to our regularly scheduled program, Chapter 7. Preparations for the crossing. As the officers and men gathered in the town, Wasson kept his plans for the crossing of the Delaware River under wraps. He wanted to keep it secret from the British until the last possible moment. Undercover, he sent out orders that had been given weeks ago for boats to be placed at strategic locations along the river. The order was given to gather up all the boats, ferries, and ram boats in the area and have them ready to transport troops across the Delaware. People saw the military activity, but no one knew what it meant. All they saw were hundreds of men assembling along the river with boats. Some people said it was just another drill. They'd seen the British do this before. It was always something of a spectacle to watch the British soldiers line up on the bank of the river and pretend to board boats. But then they would always go back to their camp and the townspeople would get on with their lives. This time, there would be no drill. This time, the boats would actually cross the river. Now that Washington was in town, the weather took a turn for the worse. A nor'easter was brewing, winds rising and rain pounding the ground. The river was swollen with each passing day and the temperature dropped dramatically. By December, it was clear that the storm would make any sort of crossing nearly impossible. Even if they could get the boats into the water, how could they row against the current and wind? How could they control the boats once they were in the raging water? The weather was just too rough. Men huddled around fires, trying to stay warm, sharing stories and laughing to keep their spirits up. They looked out at the churning river and wondered what the general would decide. Would they spend New Year's Eve in this awful weather? What would happen next? Washington stood watching the river with grim determination on his face. He needed to send a message to the British. He needed them to know that no matter how bad the weather got, no matter how rough the river became, he would cross on that night and take his message to the people of Trenton. He knew they needed to see him, to hear his message in person, to feel the hope that he could give them. On Christmas morning, everyone awoke to find the snow had finally stopped. The clouds were still dark and heavy, but the wind had died down and the river was still, almost calm. Could this be the night? As the men prepared to eat breakfast, Washington addressed his troops. They would cross tonight. He told them to have a hearty breakfast and warned them to take only what they could carry. Then he left the mess hall and went to see his friend, John Paul Jones, who commanded the naval force that would help ferry the troops across the river. They had a final meeting, going over the plan one last time. Washington gave Jones the signal, 3 simultaneous gun salutes, that would let him know that all the other boats were launched and it was time to move out. Jones saluted the general and watched him right away. He felt a mix of excitement and fear as he prepared his fleet of ships. This was the most important mission he had ever undertaken. If tis failed, the entire American Revolution might collapse right before their eyes. Jones assembled his crew and gave them their orders. Then he took his place at the helm of the brig and turned his thoughts to his family. His wife and children were in France. He hadn't seen them since he left his homeland to join the fight for American independence. Had they heard about him? Did they think he was a hero or a madman? Maybe both. He would soon be famous throughout Europe if this mission succeeded. If not, well, his name would be forgotten forever. He shoved those thoughts aside and focused on the task at hand. Now was not the time to worry about glory or shame. It was time to serve. As evening fell, everyone was ready. Soldiers had eaten their dinners and were then given the order to prepare themselves for an evening boat ride. Many of them helped load supplies and equipment onto the boats. They worked quickly and efficiently. No one asked any questions. Everyone understood what was at stake, and that time was of the essence. Soon the boats were ready, and the troops had donned their warmest clothing and were ready to go. Washington rode his horse into the river and waded into the water. Up to his waist, he watched the first boat put off from the shore. It was filled with men and supplies. A second boat followed, and then a third. There were so many boats that they looked like a snake of many heads moving through the darkness. Each one carried its precious cargo of troops towards the other side. Washington mounted his horse and rode after them. He had to cross ahead of his men to make sure everything went smoothly. If he didn't reach the other side in time, he could end up spending Christmas night in the water. The current was strong, but his boat moved steadily towards the other side. Suddenly, a loud crack split the night. A British lookout had spotted the boats and fired his musket. Other guns followed, making the night air ring with gunfire. The Americans pressed on, racing towards the opposite bank. Washington urged his horse forward, leaning into the wind, his cloak billowing behind him. On the shore, a group of civilians cheered, waving their hats and scarves. One man held a burning candle high above his head. A young boy tugged on his father's sleeve and asked, "Will they make it?" "Father," the man squeezed his son's shoulder and said, "Yes, they'll make it. The general will bring us freedom, God willing." The boy looked back at the river and shouted, "Go, go." Washington's boat reached the bank and he leaped off, his cloak falling to the ground like a discarded flag. He helped the others land and secure the boats. Then he straightened his uniform, picked up his cloak, and strode confidently through the town. As the last of the boats came ashore, carrying the wounded and prisoners, Washington turned to face the town. The people were silent, staring at him in disbelief. Then someone broke the silence and shouted, "Long live the general." The crowd took up the cry and echoed it again and again. Long live the general. Washington raised his hand for quiet and spoke. "Friends," he said, "a few hours ago we took Trenton." The faces of the crowd exploded in cheers. Washington waited until they were quiet again. "We must march to Market Square," he said. I want you to spread the word that the British are coming. Spread it from house to house, from person to person. Tell them to be ready to leave town when we give the signal." Then he added softly, "Be ready to leave tonight." The people nodded, understanding that the British could return at any moment. As dawn approached, the shops and homes were empty. Everyone had fled to the safety of the woods. Just before the sun rose, Washington led his troops out of town and into the forest. They moved quickly, silently, and in less than an hour, they were hidden from view. When the British did come, they found only an abandoned camp and a note from the general. He had left it on purpose, hoping the British would find it and become alarmed. The note read, December 26, 1776. Colonel Rowe, who commanded the post of Trenton, has this day evacuated the town and taken post in the adjacent hills, where he will be ready to dispute our possession of the bridge. As the British began searching the area for the missing Americans, Washington and his troops made camp near Allentown. Here, Washington received word that the people of Trenton had spread the news that the British were coming. The people had sounded the alarm, and now the militia from surrounding towns were on their way to assist the Continental Army. In a few short hours, Washington would lead his troops back to Trenton and raise the flag of the United States over the town hall. The fight for independence had been hard and long, but the tide was turning, and Washington knew that with every victory, no matter how small, the future of America grew brighter. And so ends Chapter 7 of the story of the crossing of the Delaware. Join us next time for Chapter 8, The Battle for Trenton. Please remember to support the production. Give generously. The cast and crew depend on your support to continue telling these important stories. Thank you for your support. And now a special message from the cast of The Crossing of the Delaware. Hey guys, we wanted to thank you for watching this episode. Do you want to hear more historical tales like this one? Well, good news. You can listen to more stories on our podcast channel. We've got plenty of exciting adventures from American history that are sure to entertain you. So search for us on your favorite podcast platforms and subscribe. We're always adding new episodes, so you're sure to get lost in our tales for hours. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next time. The men were trudging silently through the snow toward the riverbanks, where their boats lay anchored. They made little noise because they had to. Their officers had given them that order. A December night in 1776, a New Year's Eve, more than 200 years ago, is not silent. For these men, it was deathly silent. Even their footsteps were muffled by the snow. They had been ordered to move, and they moved. The night before, the soldiers had been ordered to prepare to cross the ice-jammed Delaware and attack the heavily fortified British garrison at Trenton. Now they were moving silently toward their boats. Suddenly a voice rang out above the wind. Hold your fire. Don't fire." It was Lieutenant Colonel John Champ. He held up his hand, silencing the man with the red woolen cap who had just raised his musket. "Don't fire till you see the whites of their eyes," Champ said. Then he turned to the man beside him and said, "This cursed night has lasted long enough. Give me my horse." Champ took off his greatcoat and wrapped it around the neck of the startled animal, pulled it back into the darkness, and then, holding tight to the bridle, he rode forward. Champ was soon joined by others. Among them was American Commander George Washington. He, too, had spent the night hidden in the woods near the river. His troops were nearly 2 miles from their boats. They had to get closer. Washington urged his horse forward. As he did, a small boat crossed the river and landed near him. Out jumped some men. Among them Major General Nathaniel Greene. "General," said Greene, his face ashen, "I bring you word that our men are unable to cross. It's impossible." Washington nodded grimly. He knew that the men had been struggling against an ice jam for hours. Washington listened as another man spoke. "We must get them across somehow. If we don't, it will be a complete disaster." It was Colonel John Cox. Washington turned back to Greene. "What do you think?" he asked. Greene shook his head slowly. "I'm afraid it cannot be done. But you know your own business best, sir." Washington looked out over the dark water. The moon was hidden by clouds, and the wind tore across the river, whipping snow into tiny eddies that danced in the dim light of the oil lamp hanging from the boat. The ice jam was still there, blocking passage. Washington could hear his men shouting and hammering against it, but whether they had broken it or not, he couldn't tell. He could only hope that they had. If they hadn't, this whole plan would fail before they even got to the riverbank. Washington suddenly spurred his horse into a gallop. Come, come. He urged the animal forward. He needed to get to the riverbank to see what was happening. But as he raced through the trees, he heard the welcome crack of breaking ice. When he reached the bank, he saw the boats pushed out into the river. At last, they were going to make it. Washington watched as the first boatload of men reached the opposite shore, struggled ashore and disappeared into the darkness. More and more boats arrived, each bringing men that were wet, cold, tired, and hungry. Some stumbled out onto the bank and fell down, exhausted. Others clung to the gunwales, pulling themselves up onto the shore. They were almost at Trenton now. When the men had been brought up, Washington rode after them. He wanted to be sure everything went well when they attacked. Just beyond the riverbank, Edismunted took off his greatcoat and gave it to one of his aides, along with his saddlebags. He had to be sure that nothing was seen that would identify him. When he was sure no one was watching, he took off his boots and left them by the tree. Washington had no boots. He wore only a plain homespun suit, a waistcoat, a shirt, and a cap. He looked like any other private soldier. Washington then joined the men and walked with them along the riverbank toward Trenton. Suddenly, a loud report cracked the silence. One of the sentries had fired on an unseen object in the darkness. Washington put a finger to his lips. He, too, was tense. He could hear the men whispering excitedly, but he wanted them to keep quiet. Washington didn't want anyone to know that the commander-in-chief was here. That would only make him a target. Washington continued walking until he was sure that he was far enough away from the boats. He wasn't worried about anyone finding him here. There was no one within miles who would recognize him without his greatcoat and his boots. He walked along until he came to a small clearing. There in the darkness, he could see the tents of his soldiers. The men had been marching since before daybreak. They needed a rest if they were to have any hope of carrying out their attack in the morning. But they couldn't rest. They didn't have any blankets, and they were freezing. Washington looked around. How could he help these men? He wanted them to be rested and ready for action in the morning. Just then, a young soldier came up to him. "General," he said, "I've been looking for you." "Well, what is it?" Washington asked. "The men? They need something to keep them warm during the night." "Yes, I know," Washington replied. "Go tell them to wrap their feet in rags. That will keep the worst of the cold out." The young man stared at him in disbelief. "But General, they have no blankets, and many are barefoot." Washington sighed. He knew that the men had no blankets, but he didn't realize that so many were barefoot. "Tell them to take off their stockings and wrap their feet in rags," he said. "That will have to do." The young soldier hesitated. He still didn't like the idea. "But, General, do as I say," Washington snapped. He was frustrated. He knew that his men were poorly equipped, but he hadn't realized how poorly. He had hoped that by the time they reached Trenton, they would be able to rest, but it looked like they wouldn't be able to do that either. He thought for a moment. There had to be something that they could use to keep warm. Just then, a staff officer came up to him and said, "General, I believe those Hessian carts we captured earlier might come in handy." "Good," Washington said. "Have them brought here." In a few minutes, several carts were lined up before him. "Tell the men to cut open the sacks and use the straw to make beds on the ground. We will roll up our prisoners' blankets and sleep on top of the straw." The young soldier looked out at the river. "Will that be warm enough?" Washington shrugged. "It will have to be. Get to work, lad." The young soldier hurried off to tell the others. Washington stood watching him go. He hoped that his men would be warm enough. He knew that the longer they waited, the better chance they had of a successful attack. But how could he make them comfortable? He wondered. As the first rays of sunlight touched the treetops, the men began to stir. They unrolled their blankets, pulled on their shoes, and got ready to march. They needed to leave before the sun rose, before the British garrison at Trenton woke up and started their day. They had to be in position before anyone knew what was happening. Washington watched as the men moved out. He had never seen such a ragged, dirty, tired group of soldiers. Some were still barefoot, and many of them had wrapped rags around their feet. Washington shook his head sadly. These men had been through hell, but they were still alive. That was all that mattered. They moved out into the darkness, guided by officers who knew the way. Washington stayed behind until the men were out of sight. Then he put on his boots and his greatcoat. He was careful to button up his greatcoat so that his plain clothes could not be seen. He didn't want anyone to know that he had been with the men all night. He mounted his horse and rode back to the boats. There he found food and hot coffee waiting for him. He ate and drank, then mounted his horse and rode toward Princeton. He had to get there before his men attacked Trenton. He wanted to be with them when it happened. Today, more than 200 years later, visitors can walk along the riverbank where Washington's men crossed and attacked the British, and they can stand in the shadow of the large monument that marks the spot where Washington led his troops out of the river and marched on to victory. Visitors can also see a replica of one of the rowboats that Washington and his men used to cross the river. The boat is on display at the Old Barracks Museum in Trenton, and every Christmas Eve, people gather at Washington Crossing State Park to watch a reenactment of Washington's daring river crossing. The icy river rushed over the broken bridge, crashing against the rocks with relentless force. A deafening roar echoed through the valley, drowning out any sound of human struggle. In the darkness, 7 boats were pushed into the frigid current, each one carrying a precious cargo of soldiers, their muffled cries carried on the wind, swallowed by the raging water. They fought against the ice and the current, battling to stay afloat. But for many, it was a losing fight. The cold, unforgiving waters claimed their strength and dragged them down into its icy depths. One by one, the boats capsized, spilling their human cargo into the churning water. Some managed to scramble onto the upturned vessels, clinging to the wreckage like drowning men to a life raft. Others disappeared beneath the surface, their fate uncertain in the swirling chaos. Amidst this desperate struggle, a single figure stood resolute, tall and imposing. He watched the unfolding drama with grim determination etched on his face. General George Washington, Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, had ordered the crossing of the Delaware River. His troops, battered and demoralized from recent defeats, would spend the Christmas night ferrying across the ice-jammed river to a location known only to a few. Once there, they would launch a surprise attack on the Hessian garrison at Trenton, hopefully turning the tide of the war. But as the fierce current tugged at his uniform and the biting cold threatened to sap his strength, Washington couldn't shake off a growing sense of foreboding. Would this daring gamble pay off, or would his troops be lost to the merciless river and the treacherous battle ahead? A survivor of the crossing later recounted the harrowing scene. Pulling, hauling, he said. The boats were filled with men, and just as many with baggage. The first 3 boats that went over were filled with infantry, each under the command of a commissioned officer. The 4th boat was filled with artillery and ammunition. No one would undertake to go in this boat but Henry Knox, who was afterwards Secretary of War. The 5th boat was filled with infantry. The 6th and 7th boats were filled with artillery and ammunition, and all of them went on the same even pace until we came abreast of the main body of the ice. When our 2 last boats in the rear were filled with infantry, our men struggled hard against the ice and the boats were shattered to pieces. Some of our men were taken off with the pieces of the boats, and others were thrown into the water. All the officers and soldiers who were in the boats that were filled with artillery and ammunition escaped except Knox, who was the only person that remained in the last boat and was taken off in a swoon. Several of the soldiers who were in the water were taken off in a fit of swimming. All of those in the other boats were either taken off the boats before they sunk or climbed on the wrecks, and some of them swam ashore. Henry Knox, already a hero at the siege of Boston, now faced a perilous test of courage and determination. Alone in a sinking boat amidst a raging river, he battled against the freezing current and the unforgiving ice, driven by an unwavering resolve to deliver the artillery to his comrades on the other side. With each stroke, he inched closer to safety, his muscles burning and his fingers stiffening with cold. The weight of his mission pressed heavily on him. If he failed, the crossing would be in jeopardy, and the hopes of victory at Trenton would crumble along with it. Yet he pushed on, refusing to yield to the icy grip of the river. Finally, as dawn broke, he saw the welcoming sight of land. Summoning a final burst of strength, he reached out and grabbed a branch, pulling himself from the water and collapsing onto the bank, exhausted but triumphant. His arduous journey was over, and he had lived to tell the tale of his heroic struggle against the raging Delaware. As Washington pulled his dripping and frozen body from the water, he turned to Knox and exclaimed, "I am glad you have come, but, goddamn, what a price we have paid to get here." The general surveyed the scene before him, and his heart sank. Of the 8 boats that had set out across the icy Delaware, only 4 had made it to the shore, laden with weary soldiers and heavy artillery. But it was a bittersweet victory. Of the more than 2,000 soldiers who had embarked on the crossing, nearly 300 had been lost to the river, succumbing to the cold waters or disappearing beneath the wreckage of overturned boats. The casualties had taken a heavy toll on the army, both in terms of manpower and morale. Yet despite the heavy losses and the chilling grip of despair, Washington refused to let his men succumb to defeat. He rallied his troops, urging them to press forward towards their destination at Trenton. Now severely depleted in numbers, the Continental Army moved forward, their steps echoing the determination that burned in their hearts. They pushed onward, their faces grim, their eyes fixed on the goal that lay ahead. Hope flickered like a candle in the wind, threatened by the darkness but refusing to be extinguished. For these brave soldiers, the crossing of the Delaware was more than just a military operation. It was a testament to the indomitable spirit that resided within them. As they trudged through the icy waters that had tested their strength and claimed their comrades, they carried with them the memory of those who had fallen. Each step forward was a tribute to their sacrifice, a promise to honor their sacrifice with victory. The road ahead was fraught with uncertainty and danger, but the soldiers pressed on, their spirits unbroken, ready to face whatever challenges lay in wait at Trenton. In the early hours of December 1776, after having crossed the Delaware and made camp near Trenton, a hush fell over the assembled troops. The roaring river and the howling winds seemed to fall silent, replaced by an eerie stillness that mirrored the tension in the soldiers' hearts. This was no ordinary night. This was Christmas, a night when families gathered around hearths, sharing the warmth of togetherness. But for these men, the only warmth they knew was the flickering glow of their campfires, struggling to pierce the darkness that enveloped not just the night sky, but their spirits as well. There was something undeniably powerful about the sight of these men standing steadfast in the face of such daunting odds, their silhouettes stark and resolute against the backdrop of the starless sky. They were a study in quiet determination, their movements precise and efficient as they prepared for the arduous task that lay ahead. The absence of laughter, of carols, was palpable, a stark reminder of the gravity of their situation. But within that silence, a different kind of camaraderie was forged, a bond of brotherhood that transcended the bleakness of their circumstances. These men were not just soldiers, they were storytellers in the grand narrative of their nation's birth. Their bravery and resilience would be sung about in tales whispered around future campfires, ensuring that their sacrifices would never be forgotten. As the night wore on, a profound sense of anticipation hung in the air, as palpable as the frost that glistened on the ground. What transpired during those silent hours before dawn was not just a military operation. It was a testament to the unbreakable spirit of these men. It was a silent vow, a promise etched in their determined faces, illuminated by the flickering firelight that they would face the coming dawn with courage, with honor, and with the unwavering belief in the cause that bound them together. The crossing had been perilous. The night was lonely, but their spirits remained unbroken. And as the first faint streaks of dawn began to paint the eastern sky, the men of the Continental Army stood ready, their eyes reflecting the dawning of a new day, a day that would forever be etched in the annals of American history as the day they dared to defy the odds and secured a victory that echoed across the ages. So ends Chapter 9. The crossing begins. Tune in next time for Chapter 10, where the attack on Trenton will be launched. Will Washington and his men prevail against the Hessians, or will the British reinforcements arrive in time to save the day? Only time will tell. So stay tuned for more updates, and don't forget to subscribe for more exciting historical tales. See you in the next episode. Alright, we're back to our regularly scheduled programming. This is Chapter 10, The Legendary Image. I really don't want to do this. It's one of those things that comes up in my notes. I'm like, oh, that's easy. That'll be a 5-minute video. And then you actually start to research it and you're like, dear God, where do I even start? So if this isn't like an epic 5-part miniseries, just know that the reason is pure laziness. Anyway, this is about Washington crossing the Delaware, but more specifically how Washington crossing the Delaware became a thing. So obviously you guys have all seen the most famous version, right? The one by Emanuel Leutz, painted in 1850. I think it's literally called Washington Crossing the Delaware. This is the one that everybody thinks of. And in fact, that painting has become so iconic that it has been reproduced on everything from calendars to tea towels to playing cards. And of course, the VA tried to sell it to you at the gift store at every major museum in the United States. You cannot escape this image. And on some level, I think that's why I was so overwhelmed with researching this. It's because this image, whether we love it or hate it, it's so ingrained into our culture that we kind of take it for granted. So let's go ahead and talk about what's wrong with it. Let's start there. But before we do that, let me say this. There are lots of paintings of Washington crossing the Delaware. But when people say they're talking about this one, if you look at it, it doesn't really look very good. Like, the perspective is weird. The guy whose job it is to row the boat isn't rowing the boat. George Washington looks like he's having a stroke. Everybody else is weirdly proportioned. Like it's a mess. It's not a good painting. It's technically not even very accurate. The most famous painting of George Washington crossing the Delaware isn't really that accurate. I mean, the whole idea of this painting is that it captures this moment from December 26th, 1776, when George Washington led his troops across the Delaware River in order to surprise attack a group of Hessians stationed in Trenton, New Jersey. They won the battle, and this became one of America's most important victories during the Revolutionary War. And it's a really cool story. But as far as this painting goes, it's kind of just a fantasy. I mean, the original idea was that Washington crossed the river near a place called McConkey's Ferry, which is now part of a state park in New Jersey called Washington Crossing State Park. But the painting makes it seem like they crossed somewhere up here in Pennsylvania, like Washington S, wearing clothes that are way too warm for this to actually take place in New Jersey in December. Like it's just silly. But it is also odd that Washington is the only person in the boat who is UNT wearing a coat. He is just standing there looking majestic as everyone else struggles to row the boat through the frigid waters of the Delaware River. And I guess you could argue that since he's the general, he shouldn't have to do manual labor. But it's just weird. But more importantly, there is no way that Washington would have been able to stand in that boat and not fall over. I mean, the guy is 6'2", which was unusually tall even back then, and he weighs about 200 pounds, which these days would probably make him a candidate for morbid obesity. There's no way that he could have stood up in that boat without tipping it over, not to mention the weight of the horse and the baggage that they had to carry with them. This image doesn't capture any of that. What it does capture, though, is the spirit of America. I mean, I'm not saying it's a good painting, but I can see why it became so popular. Part of it is that it gives us exactly what we want. This larger-than-life image of George Washington as this heroic figure leading his men across the Delaware on this daring mission. It also plays into the mythology of the founding of America that we tell ourselves. This idea that we were this ragtag group of rebels who took on the mighty British Empire and won. Primera Mea. Washington is literally standing in a boat with his troops on the shore of New Jersey behind him and Britain across the river. I mean, it's such a cool image that it transcends the painting itself. I mean, in 1859, just 9 years after the painting was completed, an engraving of it was included on the first U.S. postage stamp. And then again, in 1934, the government commissioned a huge mural of it to be painted on the wall of the Rayburn House office building in Washington, D.C., and of course, every Christmas, we've got the U.S. Postal Service putting out their set of Washington Crossing the Delaware Christmas stamps. Like, this image is everywhere, and it's basically synonymous with American patriotism. But it wasn't always that way. Like, it didn't even become popular until the mid-19th century, long after the events of the Revolutionary War. And even then it took another 50 years before it became the iconic image that we all know today. I mean, in the early 1800s, there was a different painting that was much more popular. One called The Death of General Mercer by an artist named John Trumbull. It shows the death of a general during the Battle of Princeton in 1777. And it was so popular that at one point it hung in the U.S. Capitol building. So why did it take so long for this image to catch on? Well, it helps to know a little bit about the artist, Emanuel Leutz. I mean, he started off his career as a history painter, which back then was a very prestigious genre of art. but he quickly developed a reputation for being unreliable and lazy. He spent most of his career traveling around Europe, mostly Germany, living a bohemian lifestyle, painting basically whatever he felt like. He produced some pretty good stuff, I'll admit, but it wasn't always well received, and he struggled to make enough money to survive. So in 1848, he packed up and moved to New York City because, well, New York was the art capital of the world back then. The problem was he didn't know any of the wealthy patrons that he needed to sell his work to, so he did something kind of desperate. He rented a room at the home of a wealthy family and offered to paint their children in exchange for free board. In fact, he ended up painting one of their daughters 7 times, and that was around the time when he created what would become his most famous work, Washington crossing the Delaware. Now, we don't know exactly when he painted it, but it was probably around this time. And it's interesting that he chose to paint this event, because it was kind of obscure at the time. I mean, everyone knew about George Washington, obviously, but the story of him crossing the Delaware to surprise attack the Hessians wasn't well known. In fact, it was NT until 1964 that a historian discovered the diary of a man who was actually present at the Battle of Trenton, and he had this to say about Washington's role in the battle. Quote, "General Washington neither led the attack, nor was he in any danger during the whole affair. He acted as a spectator, it is true, but in safety. His situation was on the hill at some distance from the battle. So not exactly the stuff of legend. But that didn't stop Lloyds from creating this massive painting of it. I mean, it's nearly 9 feet wide and 5 feet tall, which makes it about twice the size of your average canvas, and he put everything he had into it. I mean, you can tell that he cared about this painting a lot. Part of it is the detail. Like if you look closely, you can see the individual faces of the soldiers, the expressions on their faces, the way their bodies are moving, like he really brought them to life. Another part of it is the symbolism. I mean, you've got Washington standing tall in the boat, leading his men across the river, and it was that symbolism that really captured the American imagination. I mean, it's hard to look at this painting and not feel inspired, and that's why it's been reproduced so often, why it's become such a powerful image. I mean, we don't necessarily remember Lloyds's name, but we all recognize the image he painted, and that's why this is the perfect topic for a channel like this one. Because while it's not a great painting, it's become one of the most important images in American history. If you enjoyed this video, check out this other one. The year is 1776. The place is Trenton, New Jersey. And today we bring you episode 11 of our series, based on the book Washington S. Crossing by David Hackett Fisher. Now, before we get into it, I just want to say thank you to all of our new supporters who have joined us over the last few days. We're so glad to have you here. If you'd like to join them, the link is below. Also, I just want to remind everyone that this Saturday, December, we are having our very first live stream for our supporters. So if you're a supporter, make sure to check your email. There should be a link there for the live stream. Otherwise, if you're not a supporter, well then what are you waiting for? Join up and get access to all those cool perks, including live streams. The link is below. Okay, let's do this. Chapter 11. The March to Trenton. Dawn had broken by the time the advance guard under Israel Putnam reached the far shore of the Delaware, but the troops were so exhausted that they pushed forward only slowly and wearily. As the sun rose higher, thousands of men trudged along the riverbank through mud and water, their clothes soaked to the bone and their faces grim with cold and fatigue. All around them, the icy gusts of wind moaned and howled. A thick snow began to fall, and soon the men were knee-deep in it. The storm seemed to suck the very marrow from their bones, and many stumbled forward, staggering like drunken sailors. About 11 o'clock, however, General Washington, riding with his staff down the line, found that the column was losing all momentum and might actually break down right where it stood. This could mean disaster. For more than 24 hours now, the army had been on the move. The men had marched 18 miles the day before and crossed the ice-jammed river in the night, and now they were almost exactly where they had been when they started out. If he didn't get them moving again soon, they would be forced to spend another night in the rain and snow, which would probably decimate their already low numbers with sickness. Washington knew he had to pull something out of his hat. At noon, with the army still barely moving, he ordered call. John Lamb's brigade to march ahead. From his headquarters, he dispatched to aides Lieutenant Colonel James Armfield and Major Thomas Posey to ride forward and urge on the lagging troops. "Quick! Quick!" shouted Armfield, urging the men to hurry up. "General Washington wants to speak to you." That got their attention. Now, if they couldn't go faster, at least they could go forward, and they did. Washington kept the columns moving steadily along the river road, but not swiftly. He had given orders that no one was to run or ride faster than a walk. Even the baggage wagons were ordered to keep up with the column, though that proved impossible, and many were left behind. As the afternoon wore on, the storm grew steadily worse, and both snow and sleet fell in torrents. By 3:30, the temperature had dropped to an almost unbearable level. Washington feared the worst. Just as he had predicted, they were going to lose the element of time. According to his calculations, if they moved at this snail's pace, they would reach Trenton about 10 o'clock at night. But even if they could double their rate of speed, they wouldn't arrive until midnight, and that would be too late to launch a surprise attack on the Hessians. His hopes for catching Trenton by surprise were fading fast. Yet somehow Washington managed to maintain his composure. Throughout the long afternoon, he continued to dispatch officers back up the line to urge the men on. "March! Good march!" he called. "Come on, you dogs, come on." And all the while, he kept moving forward. At 5 o'clock, his aides reported that the van was 5 miles ahead, and that meant they were making better time. But still, he wasn't satisfied. Now, to make matters worse, the road was a terrible quagmire, and as the sky grew darker, the soft earth turned to heavy, sucking mud. Washington's horse fell into a rut and nearly broke its leg. He was forced to dismount and help pull the animal out. Even then, he wouldn't stop. When his saddlebags were cut to free him, he had to be literally dragged forward by his officers. The van finally reached Field's Point at 6:30, and Washington was furious. 5 hours had passed since they left the river crossing, and most of that time they hadn't even been moving. He wanted to get to Trenton as fast as possible, and now precious time was slipping away. But he kept riding, and now that the van had passed, he pushed forward with the rear guard, and the sight that met his eyes as he crested the last rise half a mile from town brought a smile to his weather-beaten face. At last, the Hessians were in for a big surprise. Before him lay the town of Trenton, black and silent against the darkening sky. Every house was shuttered up tight. Not a soul stirred in the street. Washington rode slowly forward. His mind raced with plans of attack. Everything was going perfectly. The town was unguarded. It looked as if the Hessians had abandoned the place. He halted at the corner of Broad and Market Streets. His aides and officers crowded around him, eager for his instructions. He made sure that all the regiments were in place and that everything was ready for action. Then he led the way toward the bridge over the Assumping Creek. They crossed the bridge and Washington rode up the hill to a point overlooking the town. From here, he could see every street, every house, and then he saw that lights were beginning to appear in some of the windows. Soldiers were marching along the sidewalks, bayonets gleaming. Guards stood at the corners of the principal buildings, and on the bridge behind him, sentries paced back and forth. Washington was hidden in the darkness, watching, waiting. At 9 o'clock, as the appointed signal, a volley of musket shots rang out from the woods near the bridge. Washington watched as the Hessians came pouring out of their barracks and formed ranks in the street. And just as suddenly, the American troops opened fire. Again and again, the redcoats advanced. 10 fell back, forming ranks. Advancing again, falling back. And still, the fighting raged in the streets. Then something happened that Washington never expected. The Hessians retreated across the bridge and disappeared from view. He watched, dumbfounded, as the sentries strolled carelessly back and forth, seemingly unconcerned. Could it be that the Hessians had abandoned the town after all? He had to find out. Leaving his horse with the others, Washington hurried down the hill and raced toward the bridge. On the way, he met a young woman who had just come out of the tavern in town. "Madame," he asked, "have you seen any soldiers in town?" "Soldiers," she replied, staring at him strangely. "There are thousands of them in town, sir, and not only soldiers, but British officers and their families. Ladies and gentlemen, and they're all celebrating." Celebrating? What did she mean? Washington pressed her for an answer, and then the truth dawned on him. The Hessians weren't retreating across the bridge because they had abandoned the town. They had crossed the river and were safely encamped on the west side. He raced onto the bridge, and there in front of him, stretching as far as he could see, were the lights of the encampment, red and yellow, flickering in the darkness. Beside him, an officer cried out in dismay. "Oh, God damnation!" Washington said, clenching his fists. We're too late. And yet, even as he said the words, he felt a surge of pride. His troops had fought bravely and well, and the Hessians had been driven from the town. The rest didn't matter. Washington turned and strode back toward the tavern, his long, dark hair streaming behind him like a banner. He was wet and cold and hungry, but he didn't care. With each step, his resolve hardened. No matter what happened now, he knew he would never give up the fight for independence. And so ends Chapter 11 of Washington's Crossing. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, please remember to leave us a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already. Also, don't forget that this Saturday, December, we are having our very first live stream for our supporters. So if you're a supporter, make sure to check your email for the link. Otherwise, if you're not a supporter, well, then what are you waiting for? Join up and get access to all those cool perks, including live streams. The link is below. Anyway, I'll see you next time. Thank you for watching. December 26th, 1776. The world held its breath. Just hours before, under the cover of a raging nor'easter, George Washington and his beleaguered Continental Army had achieved the impossible. They had crossed the ice-choked Delaware River. Now, as the first light of a frigid morning broke through the sleet and snow, they were marching on Trenton, New Jersey. 9 miles stood between them and their target. Their footprints in the snow were stained with blood from their worn-out boots. Many had no boots at all. This wasn't just a march. It was an act of sheer will against the elements, against despair. Their objective was a garrison of Hessian soldiers, elite German mercenaries, fighting for the British. Stationed in Trenton, they were commanded by Colonel Johann Raoul. The Hessians were professional, battle-hardened troops, widely considered some of the best in the world. They felt secure, almost invincible. They believed the wretched American rebels were a spent force, freezing and starving on the other side of an impassable river. The idea of a winter attack, especially after Christmas, was unthinkable in 18th century warfare. It just wasn't done. So, they had celebrated the holiday with gusto, secure in their warm billets, oblivious to the storm gathering not just in the sky, but on the road from McConkey's Ferry. As Washington's force, split into 2 columns, approached the outskirts of Trenton, the element of surprise was absolute. One column, led by General Nathaniel Greene, would attack from the north. The other, under General John Sullivan, would advance along the river road, cutting off any escape. Washington himself rode with Greene's men, a commanding and stoic figure on his horse, his presence a silent promise to his exhausted troops. They had endured so much: the defeats in New York, the humiliating retreat across New Jersey. This was their moment to strike back. The first shots rang out just as dawn was breaking. An American sentry post, positioned ahead of the main force, engaged a Hessian picket. The alarm was sounded, but it was too late. The Hessians, groggy and startled from their Christmas revelry, stumbled out of their quarters into chaos. The crackle of musketry echoed through the streets, joined by the thunderous roar of American cannons. Captain Alexander Hamilton, a young and ambitious officer, had positioned his artillery at the head of King and Queen Streets, the main arteries of the town. His cannons now commanded the town center, pouring devastating fire down the narrow lanes. The Hessians, though caught completely off guard, were professionals. They tried to form ranks amidst the confusion. Drummers beat the call to arms as officers shouted orders that were swallowed by the din of battle. They were fighting in their own streets, but it was the Americans who held the advantage. The rebels used the houses and fences for cover, firing with a precision and ferocity the Hessians did not expect. It was a fierce, swirling street fight, snowflakes mixed with gunpowder smoke, creating a gray, disorienting haze. Colonel Raoul, roused from his bed, bravely tried to rally his men. He managed to get 2 of his regiments to form up and attempted but American fire was coming from all directions. The rebels were not a disorganized militia. They were a determined army, moving with purpose. Raoul, on horseback, trying to direct his troops, became an easy target. 2 bullets struck him, and he slumped from his saddle, mortally wounded. With their commander down, the Hessians' spirit began to break. Their formations faltered. They were trapped. Sullivan's division had successfully blocked their escape route across the Assumping Creek Bridge. Greene's division was pressing them from the north and west. From his vantage point on high ground, Washington watched the battle unfold. He directed his troops with a calm, steady hand, sending reinforcements where they were needed most. His strategic genius on full display. He saw the Hessian lines waver and then collapse. Surrounded, outmaneuvered, and with their leadership shattered, the mercenaries had no choice. The fighting had lasted less than an hour. A white flag appeared. The Hessians began to lay down their arms. The impossible had happened. When the smoke cleared, the scale of the victory was astounding. The Continental Army had suffered only a handful of casualties, mostly from frostbite and exposure during the march, not from combat. In contrast, they had captured nearly 1,000 Hessian prisoners, along with a vast store of muskets, ammunition, and cannons. It was a stunning and complete triumph. The news of Trenton spread like wildfire. It was more than just a military victory. It was a shot of adrenaline to the heart of the American cause. Just a week before, the revolution had seemed on the brink of collapse. Thomas Paine had written, "These are the times that try men's souls." But now, there was hope. The victory at Trenton reversed the psychological tide of the war. It shattered the myth of Hessian invincibility and proved that the Continental Army could stand and fight against Europe's finest. It inspired soldiers to re-enlist and encouraged new recruits to join the cause. Washington had not just saved his army. He had saved the American Revolution itself. The gamble on the Delaware, the desperate Christmas crossing, had paid off in the most spectacular fashion, changing the course of history in the snowy streets of a small New Jersey town. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey back in time. If you found this story as inspiring as I do, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the pivotal moments that shaped our world. Don't forget to ring the notification bell so you never miss an episode. See you next time. Chapter 13. Reactions to Victory. As we left off in the last video, the battle is over. George Washington has defeated the British, sending them back into New York City with their tails between their legs. Now, as you can imagine, this victory at Trenton was a big deal. So in this video, we're going to talk about Chapter 13, Reactions to Victory, from the book The American Revolution by historian Alan Taylor. So if you're ready to get them brain cows milked, then let's get to it. All right. So the first thing that happened, of course, was that the Americans' morale went through the roof after this victory. It was like a switch had been flipped during the night. What was so great about this was that the men who had been dejected and demoralized and ready to throw down their arms were now jumping up and down and hugging each other and singing and dancing and all that. And this spread throughout the colonies. The news traveled really quickly. In fact, within a week, every single colony from Georgia all the way up to New England knew that Washington had won a stunning victory at Trenton. And with that news came new hope and encouragement for the Patriot cause. Congress was re-energized, as were all the other Patriot supporters. And even some people who were kind of on the fence started leaning more and more towards supporting the revolution, because if they could beat the British like that, then maybe there was hope. And the British were totally stunned. They were completely shocked that Washington would be bold enough to attack them when they were at their most vulnerable. They were also surprised by the fact that the attack actually worked. The British just assumed that Washington would never take such a risk, especially not right before Christmas, because he was known as being very cautious and not wanting to gamble. But now the British were worried. This victory emboldened Washington and his troops, while at the same time it demoralized the British forces and those who supported the war back in Britain. The thing that surprised the British the most was that Washington was willing to attack them, to show that the Americans could win victories against them, which they did. And two, the fact that he was willing to take such a risk. Like I said, they just didn't think he was capable of such audacity. And that's the main idea behind this chapter. Washington has proven that he is capable of audacious moves, and the Americans have proven that they are capable of winning against the British. So things have changed. Throughout this chapter, Taylor shows us how this one victory changed everything for both sides. The most important thing to understand about this chapter is the impact that this battle and the crossing of the Delaware had on the morale of both sides. It was a huge blow to the British and a huge boost to the Patriots. After the battle, Washington's army gathered all the prisoners and the weapons that they could find and began parading around Trenton with their newfound booty. You know what else they found? A copy of the New York Journal, which was a loyalist newspaper that had come across the Delaware with the British troops. They found an issue from December, which talked about how the British were going to take it to the rebels. And now the pages of that very newspaper were being used as chamber pots to boil their captured officer's goose. Here's how the chapter starts. The day after his victory at Trenton, General George Washington stood at his headquarters in the village, watching his troops parade back and forth with small arms and ammunition captured from the enemy. He smiled at the spectacle, but his face was grave, for he knew that he had done nothing yet to turn his victory into a lasting achievement. I love this part right here. That's good line. His victory at Trenton had been achieved at too great a cost to be remembered merely as a brilliant but sterile episode of military glory. This is a good line, too. He knows that the battle is won, but he also knows that it's only one battle in a long war. And even though he won, he lost hundreds of men, almost as many as his enemy, and he still faces the problem of where to get supplies and how to keep his troops fed and in uniform. To make matters worse, he had received word that the British were returning to retake Trenton. So what does he do? He immediately gets to work. First thing he does is call a meeting with his generals and officers, and they discuss what to do next. Should they stay put in Trenton, or should they try to escape with their wounded and prisoners and just fall back and regroup? Or should they pursue the British? There's a lot of debate here. Washington wants to pursue the British, but he's afraid that if he does, he'll be outnumbered and his victory at Trenton will be turned into a defeat. And the second thing is that he doesn't want to seem too aggressive. The colonies, he says, are not yet ready to hear of such boldness, meaning that if he pursued the British, he would need to move quickly. And he thinks that the colonies aren't ready for that kind of news, that they couldn't handle it. They wouldn't be able to keep a secret like that. But if he seemed too aggressive, then the war would become too unpopular and they would lose support. Now, while they're having this meeting, someone comes running into the room breathless, saying that the British are coming back. He saw them with his own eyes as he was out foraging for food, and Washington immediately sends him away, knowing that if his troops see them coming, they're gonna panic. He doesn't want them to know that he's thinking about pursuing the British. Washington tells his officers that they'll leave tomorrow morning. As soon as the sun comes up, they're out of Trenton and heading south. So everyone goes to bed that night thinking that they're just pulling back, that they're retreating from Trenton. Then in the morning, as they're getting ready to go, Washington calls another meeting and tells his officers, "No, we're not retreating. We're pursuing the enemy. And here's why. I don't want to scare the populace, but he think it is time that the colonies understand that if we win this war, we need to be bold. It's time for bold action." And so that's what they did. They pursued the British all the way back down to New York. All right, now that's the basic plot of this chapter. Of course, there's a lot more stuff going on. I mean, it's crazy. We got Benedict Arnold leading a charge where he ends up breaking his leg. We have people capturing cannons. We have African Americans playing a vital role in the victory at Trenton. It's pretty insane, but this is how the chapter ends. Even though Washington had risked everything at Trenton, and even though his own soldiers had begun to doubt his abilities as a commander, he had won a glorious victory and proved himself once and for all to be capable of achieving strategic as well as tactical success. And in doing so, he had raised the spirits of the patriot cause throughout the colonies and given the revolutionaries a much-needed boost to their flagging morale. Most important of all, by scoring a victory on Christmas night, he had demonstrated that Americans could beat the mighty British Army under any circumstances. All right, I hope that helped. If you want even more help, then click right over there and grab a view packet. There are videos and quizzes and infographics and all kinds of awesome stuff to help you get an A in your class and a 5 on your exam in May. And of course, if this video helped you and you want me to keep making them, then subscribe and I shall oblige. All right. So I'm gonna leave you with this little tidbit. Did you know that today's video was made possible by my patrons? Every month they donate money to help me make these videos, and in return I give them extra videos and other goodies. You can learn more about that by clicking right over there. But yeah, thank you to all my patrons. I'll leave that link up there, and if you click on it, then you can see all their names and you can sign up too if you want. Alright, signing out. Alright. Now we're getting somewhere. Welcome back to the channel. In this episode, we're gonna look at chapter 14 of David Hackett Fisher's Washington's Crossing, which is called The Symbolic Power of the Crossing. And it's interesting that this is how he chose to cap off his book. Not with a discussion of what actually happened on Christmas night in terms of tactics or strategy or logistics or anything like that, but by talking about the symbolic power of what happened. Because as he argues in this chapter, it was more than just a tactical win. It was a massive propaganda victory for the Americans. It saved the revolution, if you want to think about it that way. So let's get into it. So at the beginning of this chapter, Fisher talks about how this crossing wasn't just a military action. It was also an event that had deep political and psychological significance for both sides. Now, as you've probably noticed, the book is written from Washington's perspective. And so the first point he wants to make is that the crossing strengthened Washington's reputation as a soldier and a leader. He says here, as a result of the crossing, George Washington emerged from the Delaware in the eyes of most people who knew him only as a commander of armies, one of the ablest soldiers in the world. That's a pretty strong statement, isn't it? But I think it's true. I mean, prior to this battle, there were a lot of people in America who didn't really support the war, right? They thought it was a lost cause. They thought the British were just too powerful to be defeated. There were even some people in the Continental Congress who wanted to negotiate with the British before the war even started. But after the Battle of Trenton, that was all out the window. You can't negotiate with people if you can't beat them militarily. And Washington had done the impossible by beating the British. Okay, second, Fisher says that the crossing helped Washington with his soldiers because many of them were ready to quit. They needed a good performance by their army, and they got one. So Washington's reputation was bolstered, but so was the army's. As he says, the crossing inspired soldiers to re-enlist, giving hundreds of men a reason to return to the standard they had almost universally deserted. So we know that the Battle of Trenton convinced a lot of people back home that the war could be won. But it also convinced soldiers in the field that the war could be won. Why? Well, because soldiers are human beings. Okay. They have emotions and feelings and beliefs, just like you and me, and they need to believe in something in order to fight for it. What the crossing gave them was hope. They saw that they could win. They saw that they could succeed, and that gave them the will to keep going when they might have otherwise quit. And finally, Fisher argues that the crossing helped to create the myth of American resilience. You see, the crossing was seen by many as an almost miraculous event, and that's because it was almost impossible for Washington to pull off. I mean, he had a ragtag army of inexperienced soldiers, right? They weren't trained. They weren't organized. They weren't supplied, and he was up against the most powerful military force in the world. And somehow, against all odds, he pulled off one of the most stunning victories in military history. And so the story of the crossing became a symbol of American exceptionalism. The idea that Americans are a special kind of people who can do extraordinary things when others would have failed. And that belief in American exceptionalism has been with us ever since. Think about the national anthem. Oh, say can ye see by the dawn's early light, what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight, o'er the ramparts we watched, were so gallantly streaming. We don't sing that song because we like the tune. We sing it because the words remind us of the incredible things our nation has accomplished in the past, things that seemed impossible, but which nevertheless came to pass. In a real way, then, the crossing created a sense of national identity for the Americans. It gave them a shared story that they could tell and retell to themselves and to future generations. And that story was one of courage, determination, and ultimately triumph. Now, while I agree with Dr. Fisher that the crossing had these kinds of effects, I think it's important to add a little bit of nuance to his argument. Not everyone in America reacted positively to the news of the crossing. There were, in fact, many people who thought it was a foolish and reckless move. And that was for a number of reasons. For one thing, as we discussed in previous episodes, there was the issue of partisan politics. Many people in America were strongly opposed to the war and didn't want the colonies to become independent from Britain. They either wanted independence under a constitutional monarchy, or they wanted to maintain the status quo. And so for these people, the crossing wasn't something to celebrate. It was a disaster. In Turbu, Washington had put his life and the entire American Revolution at risk for no good reason. Then, too, there was the issue of regional differences. The crossing was especially unpopular in the middle colonies. See, the people who lived in that region didn't really feel threatened by the British. To them, the war was being fought in New England and down south, and so why should they get involved? In fact, many of them had come to America precisely because they wanted to escape the kind of warfare that was being waged between the colonists and the British. But finally, there was the issue of personal safety. As we discussed in episode 30, the people who lived along the Delaware River were terrified of what might happen if the Hessians returned to the city. They felt that Washington had endangered their lives and property for no good reason. So, yeah, there were plenty of people who did not think that the crossing was a good idea. But in the end, it doesn't really matter what those people thought, does it? Because the crossing turned out to be a smashing success. And that's always how history goes. The winners write the history books. And in this case, the crossing became a symbol of American resilience, a testament to the courage and determination of George Washington and his troops. It was a story that needed to be told and retold until every American knew it by heart. Now, I want to finish this episode by going back to something that Fisher said at the beginning of the book. Do you remember that? At the very beginning, in the introduction, Fisher said that the crossing was one of the most important events in American history. And I remember thinking to myself when I read that, oh, come on, that's a bit of a stretch, right? The crossing was important, sure, but there were lots of other important events in American history. Like what about the Boston Tea Party, or the signing of the Declaration of Independence, or the writing of the Constitution? Those all seem like bigger deals to me. But now I'm not so sure. Maybe Fisher was right all along. Maybe the crossing really was one of the most important events in American history, because without it, who knows what would have happened. Maybe the Americans lose the war. Maybe they win, but at such a great cost that it doesn't really matter. Maybe they win, but only to lose again later on. Who knows? But what we do know is that the crossing didn't just change the course of the war. It changed the course of American history. It created a sense of national identity and purpose that had never existed before. It inspired generations of Americans to come. It created a belief in American exceptionalism that has lasted for centuries. And so, for that, we have to thank George Washington and his army. They may not have realized it at the time, but what they did that night on Christmas 1776 was truly something special. It was the birth of a nation. Okay, that's it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, please subscribe and leave me a comment to let me know what you think. And if you'd like to support the channel, you can do so at a website. Thanks for watching. This is Chapter 15 of our Revolutionary War series, and we're going to talk about the legacy of December 1776. So, before we get started, I just want to say thank you so much for joining us for this year's Great American Readathon. If you've been following along with us as we make our way through all 15 chapters of our book, well, congratulations on making it this far. But if you haven't joined in or you've missed some of the episodes, don't worry. You can always jump in late and get caught up. So feel free to check out the other videos in this series. And with that said, let's get started. Historians today generally agree that George Washington's crossing of the Delaware River on Christmas night in 1776 was a brilliant military move. It caught the Hessians by surprise. It allowed Washington's army to take Trenton and some much-needed prisoners, and to turn the tide of the war. For the Americans, it showed the world that they could win, and it inspired generations of people who came after with its daring spirit. But what did the men who fought in that battle think? How did they see their part in Washington's grand plan? What were they fighting for? And how did this one night in December become such an important part of our nation's history? There are two main reasons why this night still resonates with people today. The first is that the crossing was only made possible by the incredible determination of everyone involved. When Washington announced his plan to cross the river, many of his officers thought he was crazy. It was winter, The river was freezing over and there wasn't enough time to properly prepare. The men didn't have proper shoes or coats for the weather, and even if they did, they had been marching for months and were exhausted. But Washington was determined to do something to turn the tide of the war. Even if his army was tired and his supplies were low, he knew that if they could pull off a surprise attack, they might just stand a chance. And because of that, the troops got into their boats and paddled across the Delaware in the freezing cold, hoping against hope that they would succeed. They rode through the night, battling the wind and the waves and the cold until they could finally set foot on the New Jersey shore. The second reason is because the outcome of the battle was uncertain until the very end. We know now that Washington's plan worked. He surprised the Hessians at Trenton, defeated them in battle, and took 900 men prisoner. But that wasn't certain on the night of December 1776. In fact, when the fighting started, it looked like it might go very badly for the Americans. The Hessians outnumbered them almost 3-1, and the terrain favored the defense. Washington's men were forced to retreat from their initial attack, and it seemed like they might be in trouble. But Washington quickly realized that he had a problem. His artillery could unelevate enough to shoot at the Hessians in their strong position behind a stone wall. So he did something completely unexpected. He ordered his men to form a crescent around the Hessian right flank and then charge. The Hessians, taken completely by surprise, didn't stand a chance. Today, thousands of people come to Washington, crossing Historic Park each year to watch the annual reenactment of this event. Some of them are schoolchildren who are learning about the Revolutionary War for the first time. Others are seasoned history buffs who know every detail of the battle. But all of them are drawn to this place by the same two things that made the crossing so important: the determination of the men who dared to dream that America could be free, and the bravery of the men who fought to make that dream a reality. The legacy of this night is everywhere you look at Washington Crossing. There are statues and monuments and plaques that commemorate the bravery of the men who fought here. There are museums filled with artifacts from the battle, and there are even a few pieces of the old stone wall that the Hessians used to defend themselves. And of course, there's the river itself, the Delaware, which separates Pennsylvania from New Jersey and connects us all to the brave souls who crossed it on that cold night long ago. We often think of the American Revolution as a time when brave soldiers fought for our freedom. And that's true, but we also often forget that it was a time when ordinary people did extraordinary things. People like you and me who, despite the odds being stacked against them, dared to dream that America could be free. And it's that spirit that the legacy of December 1776 keeps alive. Every year, on the anniversary of the crossing, people from all over the country come to this park to remember those who fought here, and to celebrate the ideals of freedom and democracy that they fought for. Every year, the crowd gathers near the river as the sun begins to set, and as the sky darkens, a bugler sounds the call to arms. Then a group of costumed reenactors, portraying members of the crew that helped Washington cross the river, leads the crowd down to the bank. There, under a sky full of stars, they reenact the crossing, sending a small boat out into the darkness, followed by another and another, until a whole fleet has crossed the river. As the last boat reaches the New Jersey shore, the crowd cheers and fireworks light up the sky. It is easy to stand here and look out over the river and imagine what it must have been like for those men who crossed it on that cold night long ago. Men who were scared and cold and exhausted, but who were determined to do their duty and win our freedom. Men who were willing to sacrifice everything they had, including their lives, for the cause of liberty. They may have been ordinary men, but they did something extraordinary. And in doing so, they changed the course of history. As the fireworks fade and the crowd begins to disperse, it's hard not to feel inspired by their courage. These men were just like us, ordinary people who did extraordinary things, and in doing so, they changed the course of history. They remind us that no matter how difficult things may seem, we should never give up on our dreams of freedom and democracy. They remind us that we should always be willing to stand up for what we believe in, no matter what the costs. George Washington led his troops across the Delaware River on that cold night in December, not knowing what lay ahead, but he knew that he had to do something to save his army and turn the tide of the war. Against all odds, they made the crossing and won a decisive victory against the Hessians at Trenton, and in doing so, they changed the course of history. The legacy of that night lives on today in the annual reenactments, in the stories that we tell, and in the ideals that we hold dear. It is a reminder that ordinary people can do extraordinary things, and that the fight for freedom and democracy is worth having. No matter what the cost, Washington Crossing is a place where we can remember the courage of those who fought for our freedom and the ideals that they stood for. It's a place where we can be inspired to do extraordinary things ourselves. Thanks for joining us this year for the Great American Read. Be sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss any of our videos. And you can find more information about Washington's Crossing in the description below. Until next time, may we all be inspired by the courage of those who fought for our freedom and the ideals that they stood for.